Welcome to the Virtual Museum, your chance to discover the world of Tudor Cheam.
Welcome to Whitehall Historic House. The oldest parts of this building were built around the year 1500. That was 15 years into the reign of the first Tudor monarch, Henry VII. The boy who was to go on to become Henry VIII was only 9 years old when the first parts of this house were built.
So now we know that the oldest part of this house was built in the Tudor period, and you've been learning about the Tudors at school. So, what have you learned so far? Your teacher's going to pause the video now, and you can turn to your partner and tell them what you know already about Tudor England.
Today we're going to be asking the question, would you want to eat like a Tudor peasant? So that you can answer this question, we're going to be talking to you about what a peasant was, where a Tudor peasant would have sourced their food, what kinds of food they would have cooked, what their meal times were like, and what they drank.
So first of all, let's turn to who were Tudor peasants?
To understand who Tudor peasants were, we need to take a look at how Tudor society was structured, who was at the top and who was at the bottom. At the top of the society was the king. The Tudor monarch was the head of the social system. He or she was the richest person in the land, owning vast amounts of land and many palaces. Both rich and poor alike were bound to serve their monarch. Failure to do so often resulted in death. Next came gentlemen. Gentlemen were born rich, and they came from families with titles: barons, earls, dukes. Most owned large country estates and were often given important positions in government and court. The monarch would visit his most notable subjects when he or she travelled around the country, and they would be expected to provide board and lodging for the king and his courtiers. Below the gentlemen were yeomen and citizens. Both yeomen and citizens were fairly wealthy men. They were not born members of the gentry, but they were rich enough to own their own houses and employ servants. Yeomen either owned their land or would rent land from gentlemen, which they then farmed. They were often successful farmers and were rich enough to be able to afford labourers to do the heavy farming jobs for them. Labourers would work for yeomen and were paid a wage for their work. Labourers were employed to do the heavy back-breaking jobs on the farms or in the craft shops. A labourer would expect to work from sunrise to sunset in the winter and from sunrise to early evening in the summer. Sundays and Major Saints' Days were their days off. It is the labourers and the workers of Tudor England that we're going to be focusing on today. Where did Tudor peasants go to get their food?
Today we can go into any supermarket and we can find food from all over the world. However, in Tudor Cheam and in Tudor England, this wasn't possible. There were no supermarkets. So if you wanted something to eat, it would have to have been grown either in your garden or at a local farm, or you'd have bought it at a local market. There were no lorries, there were no trains, and there were no aeroplanes to bring food from other countries. So really, if the food wasn't grown locally, then you couldn't eat it.
Everything was eaten fresh. There was no fridges, no freezers, so much more difficult to store food for any length of time. Foods were eaten more seasonally. Today we can go and buy fruit near Christmas. That wasn't the case. It was all eaten and prepared when it was fresh and in season.
Ordinary people did have some ways of preserving their food. They could smoke the meat over a fire, or they could cover the meat in salt to preserve it. But this was expensive and time-consuming. Another way that food could be preserved was by pickling it in vinegar. If you were very rich, you could have preserved your food in sugar, but sugar was very expensive in the Tudor period, so the kind of people who lived at Whitehall wouldn't have been able to do that.
So, what would Tudor peasants have eaten? Take a look at the screen. On the right, we have the kinds of fruits and vegetables that we might expect to see in a supermarket or a grocer's shop today. We're going to work together to sort these into produce that was available in Tudor England and produce that was not available in Tudor England. Your teacher's now going to pause the video while you tell your partners which of these fruits and vegetables ordinary Tudor farmers and labourers would have been able to eat and to cook with. What do you think? Excellent! I bet you had some really great ideas there. Let's start by asking, were carrots available in Tudor England? What do you think? Yes! Carrots originally came from Central Asia. During the 1500s, they were grown in England, but they looked a bit different than you're used to. Orange carrots were first grown in the Netherlands in the 1600s, so our Cheam peasants would have been cooking with purple, yellow, or white carrots. Now, let's think about lemons. Would they have been available in Tudor Cheam? No, they would not have been available to your average Tudor peasant. In 1289, Eleanor of Castile, who was the wife of Edward I, had 15 lemons brought over from Spain at great expense, but even 300 years later, the lemon was still only available to those who could pay for them to be brought over from countries like France and Spain. What about tomatoes? No, I'm afraid not. Tomatoes originally came from Central America, and they were first grown and sold in England in the 1800s. What about onions? Were they available in Tudor England? Yes, onions had been brought over by the Roman legions when they invaded in the 1st century, and they quickly became an important part of the diet. Next one's my favourite, potatoes. Could Tudor peasants eat potatoes with their lunches or their dinners? No! The potato originally came from South America, and it was first brought to England around 1590. This was during the reign of the Tudor monarch Elizabeth I. For a long time, people were suspicious of the potato, and they thought that it was poisonous. What about apples? Did they have them in Tudor England? Yes. Thanks to the Romans, apples had been growing in England for over 1,000 years by the time that people were cooking at Whitehall. However, you might be surprised to know that your average Tudor peasant would not have been found chomping down on a freshly picked apple. Oh no. During the 1500s, there was a common belief that raw fruits and vegetables were bad for your health. So rather than snacking on a raw apple, they would have cooked it and stewed it instead. Next, were pineapples available to Tudor peasants, do you think? No, I'm afraid not. Pineapples were not available in Tudor England. Pineapples are tropical fruits which originally came from Brazil in South America. It was 1723 that the first pineapple was actually grown in England, and that was only in a specially designed greenhouse which contained a stove to heat up the plants. What about oranges? No, there were no oranges in Tudor England either. The Romans had brought oranges to Europe, but because of the good old British weather, the climate was never warm enough to grow them here. Until in 1561, Sir Francis Carew of Carew Manor in Beddington bought some orange trees over from France and planted them in his garden. To try to stop the orange trees from freezing to death, he built a really clever shed system where a stove would be used to keep the plants warm. It looked a bit like this.
Next, would the people who lived at Whitehall have been able to eat bananas? No, bananas were first brought to Britain in 1633 on a ship from Bermuda. What about turnips? Would a Tudor peasant have eaten turnips? Yes, turnips were brought to England by the Romans. What about broccoli? Would the Tudors who lived at Whitehall have eaten that? No, broccoli was first grown in the UK in the 1700s. What about kiwi fruit? No, I'm afraid not. The kiwi fruit was the last of all these fruits and vegetables to be introduced to the UK. It only arrived in 1952. Now finally, do you know what this is? It's a leek! Now, did Tudors have leeks to include in their meals? Yes! The leek was an important part of Tudor cooking.
We aren't sure, but we think it was introduced to the UK around the time of the Romans.
Wow, Tudor peasants had an incredibly limited selection of fruits and vegetables to choose from, didn't they?
Now we know what fruits and vegetables they had, we can turn to the question, what dishes did they cook?
Mostly they would have used these locally produced vegetables, and we've got parsnips, beans, cabbage, celery, cauliflower and garlic here, which could be used to create a pottage mixture, which was a vegetable stew, and it also contained grains, so there's some crushed oats here, otherwise they could have used barley, and herbs. So we've got thyme, sage, rosemary, and over here some parsley, and these were very commonly grown by people themselves.
Do you grow any herbs at home? What kind of herbs do you and your family use today?
Now it's time to move on to our next question. Would a Tudor peasant have eaten meat?
People who could have afforded it might have kept animals such as cows, chickens or pigs. When it came time to slaughter the animals, they would have to be as careful as they could not to eat it too quickly, because it would have had to have been stretched out to last a really nice long time to feed the family. So they would have to work very hard to preserve the meat. One thing that they might do would be to rub it with salt. Another thing that they might do to preserve the meat would be to dry it out.
What else would a Tudor peasant have eaten?
An important part of the daily routine of a Tudor peasant would have been baking bread. Bread was a really important part of their diet, and it would have been eaten with most meals, breakfast, lunch and dinner. Making bread took a great deal of time. The kitchen would have had an oven for baking, which was heated with a burning bundle of twigs. The fire would have been raked out onto the floor and then pushed into the space under the oven, while the bread itself was put inside.
People would have had different types of bread, as we do now, and the type of bread that you would commonly eat was completely down to how much you could afford to spend in buying different types of flour.
Here are 4 different types of bread that would have been eaten in Tudor England. We're going to start off with the most expensive, which was manchet. It was a very fine white bread made from wheat flour with little bran and wheat germ added. It was a creamy yellow colour, and it was the bread for the nobility. This is what the kings and queens ate. Ravelled bread, or yeoman's bread, was made from a coarser whole wheat flour with the bran left in it. It was a darker colour, and it was much less expensive than manchet. Carter's bread was a dark brown or black bread. This was the bread that the poorest people ate. It was made from maslin, a mixture of rye and wheat. Horse bread was the bread that was made from peas, beans, lentils and oats. And this was what was eaten by poor people when the wheat harvest failed.
Once you'd made your bread, you'd want to keep it fresh and safe from damp and mice, and they had a particular type of wooden box called an ark to keep it in.
Most Tudor farmers and labourers would have kept a cow. Even if they didn't have land on their own for the cow to graze on, there was a lot of common land around Cheam where they could have grazed their cow instead. What could they have made using the milk from that cow? Can you think? That's right, using the milk from the cow they could have made cheese, butter and cream, all of which are really important sources of protein.
What did they cook with?
So, what do you notice looking at the table with our containers and utensils here? Think about how they compare to the things that you would have at home now. And the immediate thing is, of course, there's no plastic, there's no metal. The poorer Tudor people would have had really wood used to make a lot of things, and then also clay as they were able to. It could also be affected if you were in a place where there was natural clay locally, as there is in Cheam. It could make it more accessible to people. So here we've got wooden beakers, wooden bowls, wooden spoons even, no metal spoons. And then of course there's pottery, which is used in this case to make a colander, and of course we would have metal today. And over here, this is called a chafing dish, and it was a way of keeping your food warm. So you would have charcoal hot in the bottom, sitting in here with a plate over the top, and then it would be a more gentle way of keeping food warm or cooking it if you didn't want to put it straight on the fire. And this is the sort of equivalent of a Tudor saucepan, with its handle so you could hold it, and glaze shiny inside to make it less porous. The rest of the cooking took place over an open hearth. This is Whitehall's hearth. Some of the pans are obviously later than Tudor, but the fire dogs here would be the sort of thing that goes back to that time.
Now we can ask, what would have been on their tables?
So these days we all put our food on a plate, which is china, or it might be pottery or plastic or metal. The Tudors didn't have plates as we think of them today, and certainly if you didn't have much money to spend, you would use what's called a trencher. This is a reproduction one, but the trencher was made out of bread, and what they would use was quite a thick slice of several days old stale bread, so it wasn't freshly made, and you put it down on your board and you put your food on top of it, your pottage and so on that we were talking about earlier. And the bread, because it was stale, would be quite resistant to the food soaking in. I guess the nearest equivalent to that these days is when we have beans on toast or something like that. But you eat your trencher. In the Tudor period, it was actually quite bad manners, unless you were very poor, to eat your trencher. You used this as a plate, you ate the food from it, but you didn't eat the trencher itself. And then, as a development from the bread trencher, they started making wooden ones. This is again a reproduction, and it has a little hollow in the centre, and you put your food on your trencher. Some trenchers had a little hole in the corner where you would put a little bit of salt to flavour your food.
What did they eat with?
So the next question is, what do you use to eat your food? You've carefully spooned your pottage out onto your trencher. What are you going to use to eat it with? And these days, of course, we have a knife and a fork and a spoon. The Tudors didn't have forks at all. They just used knives and spoons, and commonly you would keep your own knife and use it yourself, not share it.
Okay, boys and girls, we're going to play a game now, and this game takes the information that you've learned today and some of the other things that you might already know about Tudor England and tests your knowledge. So this is a game of true or false. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to say a statement, and you have to listen really carefully and then decide whether you think it's true or false. And you can show what you think with your thumbs. So if you do think it's true, we can have thumbs up. And if you think it's false, you can show me with your thumbs down. So let's get started. The first statement is, the main meal of the day was served at 1 p.m. Is that true or false?
False. It was 11 a.m.
Number 2. The Tudors liked to eat lots of freshly picked fruits and vegetables. What do you think? True or false?
False. They used to cook their fruits and vegetables before eating, and they actually thought eating a raw apple would be really bad for you.
Number 3. Tudors used to collect their water from a local river or a well. What do you think? True or false?
True, and here is Whitehall's very own well.
Number 4. Children drank beer. Is that true or false?
True, drinking water was often sourced from the same place Tudors would wash clothes and use the privy. As such, it would often make people sick. However, Tudors didn't understand about bacteria and germs, but they did understand brewed drinks were safer.
And your final true or false statement. It was forbidden to eat meat on a Friday. What do you think? It was forbidden to eat meat on a Friday. True or false?
True. Tudor England was Christian, and Christians believed that you should not eat meat on a Friday.
Now has come the time for you to show what you've learned today. So your teacher is going to be giving you a sheet, and on this sheet there is a picture of a wooden trencher, or as close to a wooden trencher as we could get anyway. And what you're going to do is you are going to choose the kind of foods that you would have put on your trencher if you were a Tudor peasant. What kind of foods would there have been? There's some clues around us here today, so maybe you could have a quick look now at what things we've got on our table, and that will help give you an idea of what to write and what to put on your trencher. Once you've drawn the food on your trencher, what I'd then like you to do is I'd like you to label the things that you've chosen. That will be your way to show your teacher what you've learned today. Now you've completed your work, I'm going to now ask you that question that I asked you at the beginning. Would you like to eat like a Tudor peasant? Think about your life today. Think about the meals you eat today. Think about what your favourite foods are. Would you much like to go back to 1500 to eat the food that you'd have eaten if you were alive then? How would it have suited you? How does it compare? Do you think you'd have been more healthy if you'd have been eating then, or less healthy? Definitely lots of things to think about today. Well done, guys.
Today we've answered the question, would you want to eat like a Tudor peasant? We've found out what food Tudor peasants ate, how they cooked, and what their meal times were like.
Thank you so much for joining us here at Whitehall Historic House today. We're open at weekends and on lots of school holidays as well, and we've always got fun activities going on. So when you go home today, do tell your parents and your guardians about us and get them to bring you along so you can see the house in person one day. Thank you. Bye.